Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashina lowered his field glasses and allowed himself a rare moment of confidence. From his command post in the cave complex near Fonte Ridge, he had spent weeks observing the American rear areas through the clear Pacific light, and what he saw confirmed everything his intelligence officers had reported. Construction workers, not infantry, not Marines, laborers. They operated bulldozers during the day, pushed cargo off landing craft, strung communication wire between medical tents. Some carried rifles slung casually over their shoulders while directing crane operations. Others wore sidearms while operating survey equipment for runway construction. They looked like factory workers who had been issued uniforms and told to build an island base, which Takashina understood was exactly what they were. His staff had compiled detailed reports on the American naval construction battalions, the Seabees, as the Americans called them, a clever wordplay he privately appreciated. They had arrived with welding equipment, concrete mixers, engineering tools. Their beach dumps contained lumber and steel plate, not additional ammunition. Their primary encampments surrounded medical facilities and supply staging areas, not defensive strongpoints. Even their name betrayed their purpose. Construction battalions. Builders, not warriors. Captain Yutaka Sugimoto, his naval liaison, had observed these same positions from a different vantage point near Cabras Island and reached identical conclusions. They dig foxholes at dusk, Sugimoto reported during the planning conference on July 23rd. But the positions are shallow, hasty. They treat defensive preparation as an administrative requirement, not a tactical priority. More damning was the pattern of their routine. Every evening, as darkness approached, the construction work would slow and eventually stop. The Americans would eat, clean their weapons with mechanical efficiency, then settle into their positions. No aggressive patrolling, no reconnaissance beyond their immediate perimeter, no indication that they expected or feared what was coming. Takashina's operations officer had identified the Kai vulnerability. The 3rd Medical Battalion's aid stations formed a triangular cluster less than 800 meters from the beach, protected primarily by these construction troops. Destroy the medical capability, his staff argued, and the Marine rifle companies would lose their will to press forward. Combat soldiers could endure many hardships, but not the knowledge that their wounded would die untreated in the darkness behind the lines. The plan crystallized with ruthless simplicity. 6 battalions, 3,000 men, would infiltrate through the draws and ravines leading down from the high ground. Silent movement, no massed formations. Small teams armed with knee mortars, grenades, and satchel charges, tasked with specific objectives: medical tents, ammunition dumps, communication centers, supply staging areas, the soft targets where the Americans had positioned their softest troops. Night would be their ally. The Americans feared darkness. This much Japanese intelligence had confirmed across every Pacific battlefield. Their defensive doctrine relied on illumination, on turning night into artificial day through parachute flares and searchlights. But in the crucial first minutes of infiltration, before artillery could respond, before reinforcements could organize, there would be chaos. And in that chaos, the construction workers would break. On the evening of July 25th, as the sun descended toward the Philippine Sea and long shadows stretched across the American positions, Takashina issued his final orders. The assault would begin at 2300 hours, late enough for American rear area troops to be settled into their routine, early enough to allow his forces the entire night to exploit whatever breakthroughs they achieved. He watched through his field glasses as darkness consumed the American beach dumps, the medical tents, the supply roads, watched as lights blinked on and then, following security protocol, were extinguished, watched as the construction workers disappeared into their shallow foxholes. In 3 hours, his infantry would move through that darkness like water through a broken dam, and the men who had spent their days building runways would learn what it meant to face soldiers who had trained their entire lives for night combat. Takashina had no doubt about the outcome. He had seen these construction troops through his field glasses for weeks. They were armed, yes, but armed was not the same as ready. The Americans were about to discover that distinction. Before we continue, click that subscribe button. Like this video and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. At 11:17 p.m., Hospital Corpsman Second Class Daniel Murphy heard the distinctive thunk of a knee mortar launching from somewhere in the darkness beyond the 3rd Medical Battalion's perimeter wire. He had exactly 2 seconds to recognize the sound before the grenade detonated 60 yards from the main aid station. The explosion shattered the night with orange flame and concussive force that sent Murphy diving behind a stack of plasma crates, his M1 carbine already in his hands. Through the canvas walls of the surgical tent, he heard Petty Officer Kowalski's voice, calm, precise, cutting through the sudden chaos. "Range 200, bearing 045. Commence firing." Mickey Torino's M19 answered first. The machine gun's muzzle flash illuminated his position in stuttering bursts as tracer rounds arced across the darkness toward movement near a cluster of palm trees. 3-round bursts, disciplined, exactly as trained. The tracers marked his beaten zone in glowing lines that swept a 60-yard arc across the approaches to the medical compound. Then the night exploded. A second M1919 opened fire from the northeastern position, its tracers crossing Torino's at a predetermined point 150 yards out, the exact intersection they had registered during daylight preparation. The interlocking fields of fire that had existed only as pencil lines on range cards suddenly became geometry, written in lead and phosphorus across the darkness. A grenade detonated near the hospital tents, then another. The distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles punctured the sustained hammering of machine guns as Japanese infiltrators fired at muzzle flashes, trying to suppress the defensive positions they had expected to overwhelm in silence. Murphy saw movement, 3 shapes sprinting toward the southern edge of the medical perimeter. His carbine came up instinctively, the front sight finding the lead figure as he'd practiced 1,000 times on the range at Camp Lejeune. He squeezed the trigger. The carbine barked 15 times in rapid succession, empty brass casings spinning away into the darkness. The shapes disappeared. Whether he'd hit them or they'd simply taken cover, Murphy couldn't tell and didn't have time to confirm. More grenades were detonating now, deeper in the compound, and he could hear the heavier reports of Thompson submachine guns as Seabees security teams engaged targets at close range. "Illumination!" someone shouted into a field telephone. Seconds later, the first artillery round burst overhead with a harsh magnesium glare that turned the jungle into stark shadows and blinding highlights. Japanese soldiers, at least a dozen of them, were suddenly visible in the open ground between the palm grove and the aid station, caught mid-approach like actors frozen on a stage. Every weapon in the perimeter opened fire simultaneously. The M1919s walked their fire across the illuminated kill zone in overlapping cones. Carbines cracked from foxholes positioned between the medical tents. A Thompson roared from somewhere near the ammunition storage area, its .45 caliber rounds designed for exactly this range, exactly this kind of target. The coordinated fire wasn't heroic, it was mechanical, practiced, the result of 4 days of preparation and hundreds of hours of training that had transformed construction workers into something the Japanese hadn't planned for: integrated defenders executing a rehearsed defensive plan. Murphy watched a Japanese soldier stumble and fall in the illuminated zone, watched another drag a wounded comrade toward the tree line, watched the interlocking fire pattern deny them every avenue of approach they attempted. The illumination round drifted on its parachute, casting swaying shadows across the battlefield. Before it burned out, another burst overhead, maintaining the artificial daylight that negated every advantage Japanese night infiltration tactics depended on. Kowalski's voice carried across the position again, still calm, still precise. "Check ammunition. Reload. Watch your sectors." The construction workers who were supposed to break didn't break. They fought. By midnight, the 3rd Medical Battalion's perimeter had become a killing ground maintained with industrial precision. Torino's M1919 had fired over 400 rounds in disciplined bursts, the barrel hot enough that he could feel the heat radiating through the night air. His hands moved automatically. Traverse left, adjust elevation, squeeze trigger, traverse right, following the patterns he'd practiced on the range at Camp Perry. Except now, the targets fired back. A Japanese team attempted to rush the surgical tent from the northeast, exploiting the brief darkness between illumination rounds. They made it 30 yards before intersecting fire from 2 Thompson submachine guns caught them in a crossfire. The .45 caliber rounds did their work at close range with brutal efficiency, and the attack collapsed into the wire. "Corpsmen up!" The call came from somewhere near the communications bunker. Murphy sprinted in a crouch, his carbine in one hand and aid bag in the other, crossing 40 yards of open ground, while tracer rounds carved glowing paths overhead. A Seabee machinist's mate lay behind a sandbagged position, shrapnel wounds across his left arm and shoulder from a knee mortar round that had detonated too close. Murphy applied pressure dressings while maintaining visual contact with his assigned sector, his carbine propped within reach. "Can you still operate the radio?" Murphy asked, his hands working with practiced efficiency. "Yeah." The wounded man's voice was tight with pain but steady. "Morphine first, though." Murphy administered the dose, marked the man's forehead with the timestamp, then was moving again before the next illumination round burst overhead. 3 more casualties required treatment within the perimeter. None life-threatening, all still capable of fighting once stabilized. The dual mission that had seemed theoretical during training was now simple necessity. Treat the wounded, return to your fighting position, engage targets as they appear. The Japanese tactics evolved as their initial infiltration failed. Small teams gave way to larger groups attempting coordinated rushes. 8, 10, 12 men moving together in the brief darkness between illumination rounds. But the Seabee defensive positions had been designed for exactly this adaptation. When a reinforced squad attempted to mass in a draw, 250 yards from the perimeter. A 60-millimeter mortar crew, operated by two Seabees who'd been mixing concrete that afternoon, dropped 3 rounds directly into the formation. The high-explosive fragmentation did its work efficiently, and the survivors scattered back into the jungle. Artillery support from the 12th Marines became a metronome of destruction. Every 90 seconds, another 105-millimeter illumination round burst overhead, maintaining the artificial daylight that stripped away every advantage the Japanese had counted on. Between illumination missions, high explosive concentrations fell on suspected assembly areas identified by forward observers who coordinated fire missions while simultaneously manning defensive positions. Petty Officer Kowalski moved between fighting positions, checking ammunition supplies and maintaining fire discipline. His voice remained steady, almost conversational. "Short bursts, watch your sectors, don't chase targets outside your lane." The construction workers responded with the same methodical competence they brought to laying concrete or operating cranes. No heroics, no panic, just systematic application of firepower to targets that entered their predetermined kill zones. By more 200 hours, the ground in front of the medical perimeter was littered with evidence of Japanese tactical failure. 33 bodies lay scattered across approaches that intelligence officers had identified as vulnerable. The vulnerable soft rear had proven to be anything but soft. Murphy returned to his aid station, his carbine's magazine empty, his hands covered in blood from treating wounded, both American and enemy. Around him, the machine guns continued their disciplined fire, and overhead, another illumination round burst into harsh light. The builders were still building. They were just building victory 1 3-round burst at a time. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to World War II Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. At 03:30 hours, Lieutenant General Takashina received the radio report that confirmed what he already knew. His counterattack was collapsing. The 18th Infantry Regiment had lost contact with 2 of its companies. The 38th Regiment reported devastating casualties around the Agat supply dumps, and from the northern sector, where the medical facilities should have been overrun hours ago. His commanders reported coordinated defensive fires that had shattered every infiltration attempt. From his command post, Takashina could hear the sustained firing that should have ended by now, could see the rhythmic burst of illumination rounds that turned the American rear areas into zones of pitiless visibility, could recognize, with the clarity that comes too late, that his intelligence assessment had been catastrophically wrong. The construction workers were fighting like infantry. In desperation, he ordered what doctrine demanded when infiltration failed: mass assault. If stealth couldn't break the American position, then shock and momentum would. 3 companies, nearly 600 men, received orders to abandon infiltration tactics and attack the medical perimeter directly. Overwhelming force, suicide determination, the warrior spirit that had carried Japanese armies across Asia. The Americans responded with industrial-scale violence. The 1st Company massed in a draw 800 yards from the Seabee positions, preparing for their assault. Artillery forward observers identified the concentration within seconds. 30 seconds later, 6 105-millimeter howitzers from the 12th Marines fired simultaneously, their shells programmed to airburst directly over the assembly area. The high-explosive rounds detonated in perfect sequence, creating a curtain of steel fragments that swept the draw clean. Survivors stumbled into secondary kill zones where pre-registered mortar concentrations waited. When the Third Company attempted to bypass the devastated area, they encountered M4 Sherman tanks from the 3rd Tank Battalion that had moved forward to reinforce threatened sectors. The Sherman's 75mm main guns fired canister rounds, giant shotgun shells that transformed each tank into a mechanized killing machine at close range. One round could neutralize an entire squad. The tanks fired methodically, traversing their turrets to cover predetermined sectors, while machine guns swept the intervals between main gunshots. What had begun as a coordinated assault disintegrated into chaos within minutes. Japanese soldiers who had trained for disciplined night attacks found themselves illuminated, targeted, and destroyed before they could close within grenade range of their objectives. The warrior spirit met prepared defensive positions and superior firepower, and spirit alone proved insufficient. At 0445 hours, Takashina attempted to recall his forces, but command and control had already fractured. Radio communications were disrupted by American artillery fires that had methodically destroyed every identified command post. Runners couldn't navigate terrain that was now registered by American mortars and covered by interlocking machine gun fire. Individual units fought on, but the coordinated offensive that was supposed to break the American invasion had become isolated groups, dying in darkness that wasn't dark anymore. Near the 3rd Medical Battalion perimeter, Torino's M1919 finally fell silent as targets stopped appearing in his sector. His ammunition belt was nearly exhausted. His hands were cramped from maintaining steady fire for over 5 hours. Around him, other Seabee positions conducted similar ceasefires as the battlefield grew quiet, except for the moans of wounded and the distant crump of artillery continuing to pound suspected Japanese positions. The sun would rise in 90 minutes. When it did, the aftermath would reveal the price of underestimating men who built runways by day and defended them by night. Takashina's doctrine had met American reality. Reality had won decisively. Dawn on July 26th revealed what darkness had hidden. Torino stood beside his M19, counting bodies in the killing zone his machine gun had swept throughout the night. 33 enemy dead lay scattered across the approaches to the 3rd Medical Battalion, Japanese soldiers who had believed construction workers wouldn't fight back. His hands, still cramped from 5 hours behind the gun, now moved with different purpose, clearing the weapon, checking for barrel wear, preparing it for storage. Around him, other Seabees conducted the same transition. The methodical efficiency they'd brought to defensive fighting now returned to its original purpose. By 0700 hours, the same men who had operated machine guns were operating bulldozers, clearing debris and preparing roads for the supply convoys that would sustain the continuing offensive. The tactical success was immediate and measurable. Lieutenant General Takashina's counterattack had cost the Japanese over 3,500 casualties, 3 battalions effectively destroyed, while American losses, though significant, had preserved the critical logistics infrastructure the entire invasion depended on. Medical facilities continued operating. Supply dumps remained intact. Communication networks functioned without interruption. Within 48 hours, Marine and Army units had eliminated organized resistance around Fonte Ridge and completed the capture of Orote Peninsula. Takashina himself was killed on July 28th, ending centralized Japanese command. The enemy forces that survived withdrew into the northern mountains, their combat effectiveness degraded beyond operational significance. The Seabees returned to building. Construction projects that had been interrupted by the night's fighting resumed with barely a pause. The same personnel who had defended the beach dumps now began preparing sites for the infrastructure that would transform Guam into a forward naval base. Pontoon piers, harbor facilities, airfield construction, work that had been theoretical during planning, now became urgent necessity. Murphy treated his last casualty from the night's fighting at 800 hours, then immediately began restocking the aid station's supplies. The surgical tents that Japanese infiltrators had tried to destroy were operating at full capacity within hours, treating wounded from the continuing offensive operations inland. The dual-mission doctrine, medical care and defensive capability, had been validated in the most decisive way possible. It had worked under combat conditions. By December 1944, facilities constructed by naval construction battalions on Guam were supporting major fleet operations throughout the Western Pacific. Harbor facilities at Apra received the capital ships that would carry the war to Japan. Airfields at Orote launched B-29 bombers on strategic missions against Japanese industrial targets. Supply depots distributed the ammunition and fuel that sustained operations from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. The personnel who built these facilities were the same men who had defended them during construction. Torino operated heavy equipment on the same ground where his machine gun had stopped Japanese infiltrators. Murphy treated construction injuries in the same aid station he'd defended with a carbine. Kowalski supervised road construction projects that connected installations across terrain that had been contested by enemy forces just months before. The strategic implications extended beyond Guam. The successful integration of construction and combat capabilities validated amphibious warfare doctrine that depended on rapid base development under contested conditions. When Admiral Nimitz reviewed the campaign, he noted that victory had been built as much as fought, and that the men who did the building had proven capable of both missions simultaneously. Lieutenant General Takashina had planned to break the Americans by attacking the men who weren't supposed to fight. Instead, those men had demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare. There are no rear areas anymore, no non-combatants, no soft targets. There are only builders who fight and fighters who build. And in the Pacific War's decisive phase, that distinction made all the difference. Don't just watch. Subscribe. Help World War II Archives Declassified. Hit 1,000 subscribers.